Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, a Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City, and I'm a staff writer and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. As always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Thank you very much, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin Magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for another episode of Soberanía.
That's a good looking cat.
For those of you just listening on audio, that was Callie the Calico Cat making her cameo appearance. She's unionized, so she will get union rate for that. And there we are. Ready for another episode.
Does she though? I mean, doesn't SAG say you have to have a speaking line? I didn't hear a meow.
She said Soberanía. That was her. That wasn't.
Oh,
that wasn't.
Wow.
That wasn't me. Yeah,
that's incredible. You
she
should
kind of
train
voices like a parrot. It's an incredible phenomenon.
Amazing. Well, it's good to be back with everybody here and talking about the latest developments here in Mexican news and politics. The rest of it, I'm going to put the rundown here up on the screen for everybody. On this week's episode, we are going to be talking about Trump's tariff threats. We're going to be leading off a discussion about that. Luckily, we're recording today on November 26th, Tuesday, and this came out last night. So we're able to get on this as quickly as possible, give you the breakdown. I'll give you a spoiler. I shared this on my Twitter account. Mexico isn't that worried. And the people who are saying they are doing so for political ends and are actually woefully uninformed. We'll get to that in Losers and Haters, but I'm jumping ahead. We're going to be talking about Two-Face Trudeau. Trudeau says one thing to leaders and then another when he's grilled by the press because he's a very bad politician. Even
Except
though
one of those
he's been
faces
at it for a very long time.
One of those faces is blackface. Ba-dum-bum-bum. Yeah.
Yes, of course. And for those of you who are not familiar, I actually lived many, many years in Canada, so I'm pretty familiar with Canadian politics, Trudeau in particular. He's likely not going to be in office for very long. Next time there's an election, he's likely to get turfed. But in the meantime, he is setting flyers that he's not going to be able to put out and picking on one of his key regional allies, which is Mexico. But it's not working out for him, so we'll get into that. And in Mexico, water is a human right. It has been for a while, but now we have a government that's actually going to make that the case and really pushing for water as a human right, really reconfiguring the entire national panorama when it comes to water access, water use, water for the people, not for corporations. That's basically the message that we're getting from the Mexican government today. So that's really good news. I know that was something that a lot of environmental activists on both sides of the border have been paying attention to, and hopefully serves as an example. As usual, we have our good news from Mexico. This one has to do with Palestine and Mexico's support for the Palestinian people and their liberation struggle. And then finally, Losers and Haters, so many of our viewers' favorite segments. We're going to get into some poor analysis, as I mentioned earlier. All right, Kurt, we're going to be talking about Trump's tariff threat. So to set the stage a little bit here, throw up this headline: Trump plans tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China that could cripple trade. The president-elect said he would impose the across-the-board tariffs on day one, and that he would stay in place until Canada, Mexico, and China halted the flow of drugs and migrants. So we know at the very end of the campaign, towards the end of October, early November, he explicitly said this was what he was going to do. I'm going to slap a 25% tariffs until they get that drug and crime problem under control, and I'm going to keep increasing it up to 100% if I have to. So he is following up on that. He is now making this policy, I suppose. He's not in office yet, but he is the president-elect. His opinion does matter. What he posts on his social media website, Truth Social, does have reverberations. And in fact, there were ripples in the market. The Canadian dollar plummeted in value to the US dollar as a result of this. So this is pretty major. So again, just to read the lead to you here, and I'll throw it over to you, Kurt, because I know you have a lot to say. President-elect Donald Trump said on Monday that he would impose tariffs on all products coming into the United States from Canada, Mexico, and China on his first day in office, a move that would scramble global supply chains and impose heavy costs on companies that rely on doing business with some of the world's largest economies. In a post on Truth Social, Mr. Trump mentioned a caravan of migrants making its way to Mexico, making it to the United States from Mexico, and said he would use an executive order to levy a 25% tariff on goods from Mexico and Canada until drugs and migrants stopped coming over the border. So there we have it. That's the scenario. Trump is reiterating his commitment that he made on the campaign trail to impose pretty extraordinary tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. Kurt, your thoughts?
So this is Trump following through on his campaign promises. And as Richard Wolff and others have pointed out, these lurid threats are great on the campaign. They're great on the campaign, right? We're going to make America great again by basically creating a fortress America in two main ways, right? First, tariff walls against foreign products, and then deportations, right, against the supposed invasion of foreigners. But when you actually get down to the nitty-gritty of it, these plans make zero economic sense. None, right? We've talked abundantly on this program and how Mexico has now become the United States' number one trading partner, how the two supply chains are totally interlinked. Actually, Claudia Sheinbaum, in a letter that we'll talk about in a minute, talks about how, ironically, these tariffs will hurt, in large sense, American businesses, U.S. businesses like General Motors and others who have been in Mexico for upwards of 80 years or more. Right. So we're talking about very interlinked supply chain, sometimes products going back and forth several times across the border until it gets to a finished product. Right. And the irony of all this, Jose Luis, and there's a lot to say about this, is that Trump won the election not because there was a huge outpouring of support for his project, for his plan. Right. It's not that the United States, went to the right. It's that the United States, a lot of people, especially in working class voters, were upset about cost of living and bread and butter issues. And one of those had to do with inflation and the cost of groceries and the cost of gasoline, among other things. What are the tariffs going to do to that? What are the tariffs going to do to that, right? We'll throw some graphs up in a minute. Just to give a couple of examples, and here we have some analysis from some of the ratings agencies and others and how the Trump tariffs will impact the U.S. economy. We're talking about here, just with the 10% tariffs, not even the 25% tariffs, we're talking about a half a point of GDP drop. Some have said up to 1.5 points in GDP drop, or even more for the United States, right? And of course, that would have a knock-on effect in Mexico, of course. So this is the point that Sheinbaum made this morning in the Mañanera. Everybody loses. Everybody loses with this, in this block, which is supposedly a block set up to help all of the countries involved and also stand against, right, some of the other trading blocks in the world, or be able to be competitive there. It's funny too, because I was watching a lot of reaction last night on social media. Just a lot of people don't even really have it totally clear how tariffs work. There's a segment of people who think that Mexico is going to pay the tariff. Mexico is not going to pay this tariff. Neither is Canada, unless there's retaliatory tariffs. Mexico is not going to pay this tariff. A tariff is a tax on imports, right? This from the party that always wants to reduce taxes. It's a tax on imports, and it's a tax that Trump can apply without having to go through Congress, which is so convenient about it. So Mexico exports its products like usual, gets paid for them, and that tax is levied. That tariff is levied in the United States. And of course, whatever business has to pay a 25% tariff, whatever, will pass that on to the end consumer. And that includes the 2/3 of tomatoes that comes from Mexico. That includes the 90% of avocados that come from Mexico. So you can have your Super Bowl guacamole. That has to do with fruits. That has to do with veg. That has to do with cars. That has to do with a whole series of products there. And as we see here on the screen, enjoy your fruit and vegetable tax, everyone. Just look at the amount of produce that comes from Mexico in the green there, right? And then another small part coming from Canada, and then all other countries. So this is going to be very clearly inflationary. Tariffs are inflationary. So that cost gets passed on to the consumer. And so then you think, okay, what is the economic logic? What's the economic justification for tariffs? Well, there is one. It's to stimulate domestic industry. It's to stimulate domestic production. Actually, historically, Great Britain and the United States industrialized themselves behind tariff walls and then began to preach free trade to everyone else. So, does that mean that the United States wants to stimulate its own fruit and veg production? Oh, but wait. They're just about to deport 11 million people, many of whom work in the agriculture industry, picking that fruit and veg. So you see how all of this is leading to a giant cluster F? If the idea of the tariff is to stimulate domestic fruit and vegetable production, you are then going to be deporting the same people that pick that fruit and veg. Do you want to then hire U.S. citizens at U.S. wages to do it? Everybody should be getting U.S. wages and much higher wages. Is that what you're going to do? Good luck finding those people, first of all. And second of all, that's also going to be inflationary. That's also going to be inflationary. This is the point of all of what we're saying. The tariffs are inflationary, and the deportation policy is also inflationary. So this is going to go, Jose Luis, very badly, very quickly, which leads to a very fundamental point that Mexico cannot give into this. Mexico has to, hold strong and hold this and ride this out, knowing this is going to go very badly for Trump's core constituencies very quickly in the United States, Jose Luis.
This is a disaster in the making. This is a disaster in the making. You're right. It's going to have inflationary pressures, and then, interestingly, likely also have a downward pressure on the economy. So it's a poison for the base that just finished electing Trump. And I really want to reiterate two things that you mentioned. One is that he didn't win because there was a rightward shift. Mostly he won because the Democrats stayed home, because they ran a bad campaign, they ran a bad candidate, they supported the genocide and were punished for it. But
17 million votes left for the Democrats. Yep.
Exactly. And so this notion that he's going to be able to carry through on this policy is basically setting himself up for a huge backlash from the very population that just elected him. How long are the voters or the people who support Trump going to tolerate these increased prices when that's the reason they voted for him? People put aside his misogyny and his racism and his flirtation with fascism, saying, but the problem is that life is just getting too expensive. Democrats didn't do a good job of this. I'm going to go for the other guy. This is really the only other option. And then he's going to bring in this policy that's going to make life more expensive. How long is it really going to last? I think not very.
And that's the question. And not to mention the fact that, the restaurant business is going to be up in arms with the deportations, right? The agriculture business, hotels and construction, massive protest is going to be against the deportation policy, lawsuits. Imagine the cost of rounding up, 11 million people, however many they're going to do it, right? Having to feed them, having to process them, having to deport them, having to handle all the lawsuits. Supposedly using the U.S. Army to be doing this, which last I heard was illegal. They're going to have to change the law on that. While the Army is already overextended in the world, and while we're already about to go into World War III in the European theater and in the Middle East, and then trying to whip up World War III in China, are there extra U.S. troops just hanging around to round up 11 million migrants, or are they going to use Blackwater mercenaries with the Prince family? How are they planning on doing this? And how are they going to handle the massive cost of that whole process at the same time that they're going to be handling inflationary pressures, and at the same time they're not going to have anybody to substitute the increased price of imports? This is what I'm talking about. We're talking about a cluster F of these two policies joining together here.
And the other point I wanted to emphasize is that you're right. Most people don't know what tariffs actually are. They seem to think that they're applied to the exporting country when they're actually applied to the importing company. Not even the importing state. That's revenue for the federal government in the United States. Yeah. It's actually a means of, in fact, before the introduction of income taxes as a standard policy throughout the globe, most governments at the federal level were funded through tariffs.
That's right.
And so I think it's really quite dangerous because eventually people are going to catch on, right? Because they're going to feel it. Maybe they're not watching news 24/7 and consuming this information, but they're going to feel it. And there's going to be a backlash. And so that brings us to the following scenario, which is what's Mexico going to do, right? Let's say this is going to go forward. So what's Mexico going to do in the face of this? I actually posit that Mexico can survive a storm for a while. There can be a situation where there is even a significant drop in exports as a result of these tariffs, where the Mexican economy, I think, I'm not an economist, but is going to be stable enough so as to avoid widespread discontent. There is a long history now of cash transfer programs to keep people afloat in the case of emergency. They played a key role in the pandemic, for example.
Right.
And so I think the U.S. will come out worse for this and will have to come back to the negotiating table eventually because of domestic pressures around these policies inside of the United States to force them to have to renegotiate something with Mexico. This kind of chest-thumping bravado that we're seeing from Trump and his ilk, I don't think is set to last long. And interestingly, we actually had a really good response from Claudia Sheinbaum today in the morning press conference, where she prepared a letter addressing so much of these immediately, which is actually really good to see the sort of the quick response, level-headed, not panicking, but also very, very much on point.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reading the letter in full, Jose Luis, because you're not going to get this anywhere else in the U.S. media. If anything, you're just going to get, the quick headline and moving on, right? The letter is very important because, it's a firm letter, but it's also an informed letter, and it lays out, I think, some of the thinking behind the Sheinbaum administration, which is we are going to lay out all the information to convince the incoming Trump administration that this is a terrible idea. But if not, we're also not going to roll over on this either. So let's read the letter. It's here up on the screen. Esteemed President-elect Donald Trump, I'm writing to you on the basis of your declaration of Monday, November 25th, about migration, the traffic of fentanyl, and tariffs. You are probably not aware that Mexico has developed an integral policy of attention for migrants from different parts of the world who cross through our territory and have as their destination the southern border of the United States of America. As a result, and per the statistics of the CBP itself, border encounters between Mexico and the United States have been reduced by 75% between December of 2023 and November of 2024. Incidentally, half of those who arrive is with a legally granted appointment with the United States through the CBP-1 program. For these reasons, caravans of migrants are not arriving at the border. Even so, it is clear that we have to arrive together at another model of labor mobility that is necessary for your country and for attention of the causes that lead families to leave their homes or their places of origin out of need. If just a percentage of what the United States destines or devotes to war would be devoted to the construction of peace and development, they would be attending to, in a profound way, the mobility of these people. I just want to repeat that. That's an important line there. If just a percentage of what the United States devoted to war were devoted to the construction of peace and development, you'd be attending in a profound way the mobility of these people. On the other hand, and for humanitarian reasons, we have always manifested our willingness, or Mexico's willingness, to avoid the epidemic of fentanyl continuing into the United States. That also is a problem of consumption and public health in the society of your country. True, right? Consumption and public health in the society of your country. So far this year, Mexican armed forces and attorney general's offices have decommissioned tons of different kinds of drugs, 10,340 weapons, and have arrested 15,640 people for violence related with drug trafficking. A law is in the process of being approved in our Congress, a constitutional reform to declare the distribution and sales of fentanyl and other synthetic drugs to be a felony without bail. However, it is publicly known that the chemical precursors for the making of these and other synthetic drugs enter into Canada, U.S., and Mexico illegally from Asian countries, for which international collaboration is urgent. You must also be aware that the illegal traffic of arms that comes into my country, the United States, 70% of illegal arms decommissioned from criminals in Mexico come from your country. Arms that we do not produce, synthetic drugs that we do not consume. Okay, drugs that we do not produce, synthetic drugs that we do not consume. Deaths by delinquency to respond to the demand for drugs in your country. Those deaths, lamentably, we provide, or we suffer. President Trump, it is not with threats or with tariffs that you are going to handle the migratory phenomenon or the drug consumption phenomenon problem in the United States. What is required is cooperation and reciprocal understanding to handle these great challenges. To one tariff, another one will come in response, and so on until we place and risk joint enterprises. Yes, joint. For example, the main exporters of Mexico to the United States are General Motors, Stellantis, and Ford Motor Company, which arrived in Mexico 80 years ago. Why place a tax that places them at risk? It is not acceptable and will cause the United States and Mexico inflation and loss of jobs. I am convinced that the economic strength of North America, the North American bloc, lies in maintaining our commercial relationship. Thus, we can continue to be competitive against other economic blocs. I consider dialogue to be the best path for understanding peace and prosperity in our nations, and I hope that our teams can work together to find it soon. So, quite good. Quite good. A firm letter, but I think laying out some of the points that we've talked about on this program, and I'll bring it all together. The traffic of drugs, the traffic of arms from U.S. to Mexico, the consumption of drugs in the United States, the fact that border crossings are down, and a lot of them are with actual legal appointments, and the fact that, and I think this is the headliner that you're going to see, and actually are already out in English, one tariff will be met with another.
Is that what you want, Trump? Do you want a tariff war? Because I don't know if the United States comes out on top of that. I don't know. Mexico has options. Mexico has much more deeper relationships. It is not in an active conflict with parts of the world. It's not provoking China. It can search for different opportunities. Right now, I put this up here as well, which I found quite fitting. Fernandez Noroña, head of the Senate right now, a firebrand, a very powerful speaker, I think puts it really well. What tariffs should we apply on their goods until they stop consuming drugs and illegally exporting drugs to our homeland? I think it's an appropriate question. If you want to be all bluster and threaten tariffs to 100% and all this and that, when are you going to get the situation in your country? What, does organized crime not exist in your country? How do you think the drugs are getting into people's homes and bodies? Just magically? The cartels, they do Amazon-like delivery to people's homes? Of course not. And in fact, there's actually all kinds of collusion, not just with U.S. citizens, which even right-wing institutes like the Cato Institute admits that fentanyl is coming in the hands of U.S. citizens, but the Border Patrol, sheriff's offices, chiefs of police, they have all been implicated in the distribution of drugs inside of the United States. And you're going to pretend like the problem's here? Because we put the bodies. As she said in the letter, I'm amazed that she included that. That's really quite impressive. And I think the appropriate response, and I think it was really quite good. I'm glad that you suggested we read the whole thing out. You're right. Where else are you going to hear this? No one's going to report on Claudia's letter, even though she makes very, very good points. It actually kind of reminds me a bit of a meme moment that happened a few months ago. They had to delete Osama bin Laden's texts from the Guardian's website, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, because people were reading it. And they're like, well, actually what he's saying is not what we've been told. He didn't mastermind 9/11 because he hates freedom. Actually, there are serious critiques of U.S. imperialism here. Not saying that I support Osama bin Laden, but if you give people the sources, let them come to their own conclusions, as opposed to spoon-feeding them biased information, as we know that mainstream media does. So this is pretty serious. But of course, I mentioned that Mexico, even if the worst case scenario, will likely come out on top, for a couple of reasons. You know, we are getting close to food sustainability. Fruits and vegetables will not skyrocket in price here in Mexico. And there are already interesting projects being developed. I wanted to mention this one. Mexico plans historic investment to expand Port of Manzanillo. Mexico is planning a generational investment in the Port of Manzanillo, its primary container gateway on the Pacific coast. The $3 billion expansion will quadruple its acreage and more than double its container capacity from 3.7 to 10 million TEU per year by 2030. The ambitious project would make Manzanillo the largest container port in Latin America and would help fuel a surge of nearshore manufacturing investment and key American trading partner. It's interesting because I think this is one element that we should probably talk about, which is that capital does not like Trump's plans. And at the end of the day, even if Trump has a certain independent streak about him, he obeys the dictates of capital in his own country. Yeah. They will eventually tell him what you're doing is bad and we're going to stop you. And if you don't, we'll get rid of you, because that's how the US democracy operates. Anything that actually threatens the interests of the people who really run the show there, the ruling class, the capitalists, will be turfed. And so there's a lot of elements here that we could continue to break down here, but I do think that the one point that I would emphasize is, again, Mexico has options. It's pursuing options. And in fact, I was watching the Mañanera this morning, and the finance minister, Rogelio de la O, says, we actually identified this trade deficit from the North American bloc with the Asian bloc a long time ago. In 2021, we actually made a proposal to Biden saying this is what we need to do. We hope to make that same proposal to Trump, right? Because since NAFTA in particular, what we've seen in the United States, Canada, and Mexico is an integration of their economies, right? The more competitive nature of global capitalism makes it so there are specializations. It's not something you can just flick a switch. And I think we mentioned this last week too. Marcelo Ebrard, what did he say? The US is not going to become a manufacturing country again, likely ever. But it's certainly not going to do it that quickly. I mean, how many billions did they invest into start to try to produce, to incentivize the production of chips? And they can't keep up. They're way behind. So this idea that you can just use tariffs to develop that manufacturing sector of the economy in the US again is not going to work. And if you keep doing that, the one that already exists in Mexico is going to focus on finding new markets via things like this Manzanillo port, which is going to facilitate trade, yes, to Asia, but also the entire Pacific coast of Latin America, right? We're talking about Ecuador, we're talking about Peru, about Chile, right? There's going to be far more trade south-south than south to north. If that's what you want to do, then if anything, you're actually facilitating a new type of global economy, which is something I would welcome.
It's actually funny / sad, right? That we're talking about here the Manzanillo port project, which is going to be the largest along the Pacific coast in Latin America. Just as China inaugurated, right? President Xi Jinping inaugurated a massive megaport in Peru. I think it was $1.5 billion megaport there, which will be able to receive and send large shipping that will now not have to pass the United States, right? Not have to pass the United States. They can just, ship directly with Asian ports. And it was so funny that the next day there was Blinken on his way to the G20 holding a press conference and photo op with some, cheap leftover old trains that they sold to Lima, saying, here is the United States investing in Latin America because we're giving them some crappy old trains. And it's just this pathetic attempt to counteract this, Chinese-built port. It's like a chapter out of The Ugly American, that book I read in high school, right? But, writ large and, dripped and drenched in the blood of a genocide. So, again, if the United States wants to play this game, it will very likely lose it. It will very likely lose it because it has neglected the region for so long. It has neglected Latin America for a generation and has only played the game of regime change and coups and threats. Meanwhile, China's become the largest trading partner of every Latin American country except Mexico. Every single one. Every single one. Right. And, it's funny that you mentioned that, the United States isn't keeping up in chips. The United States isn't keeping up in semiconductors. It's actually been the exact opposite. It was the tariffs against China that led China to become self-sufficient or more self-sufficient in these very areas. It's not the same world anymore, people. It's just not. And it's not even the same world as Trump's first term. The United States position has deteriorated significantly. And, sad to say, it's their own fault.
Interestingly, on the chips thing, Mexico's starting to has a budding industry in that. They're not as advanced as stuff you can get from Taiwan, China, and things like that, but it's growing. Right. Interestingly enough, it's happening here, despite the fact that all of the investment and all the incentives are on the other side. All right, so this is a 3-country agreement, so I think it's important to talk about the Canadian angle, and often we don't talk too much about Canada. But
what's that? Canada? What's that? Whoa.
Yeah, it's the top bunk of the United States.
Jelly donuts, I don't know, maple syrup.
Hockey.
Yeah. Rick Moranis.
Right. So Trudeau is a two-faced liar. And I say that because, so during the G20, I invite our viewers and listeners to check out our previous episode. We went over the G20 where Claudia and Justin had a brief meeting. But in this meeting, interestingly enough, Sheinbaum told that the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, said he does not agree with taking Mexico out of the treaty. He told me so clearly. So what does that tell me? In this bilateral meeting, this came up, right? What's going on with this? The Canadians are harping on about surreptitious, sneaky Chinese parts making their way through the quote-unquote back door of Mexico into the United States, and that's threatening good U.S. jobs, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of it is posturing. I think a lot of it is based on false information, but it came up in the meeting. And in this meeting, Sheinbaum says, actually, there is no Chinese car plant in Mexico. There is one in the U.S., there might be one in the future, but it's for a Mexican market, a Latin American market. It's not for North America.
Yeah, it's in Pasadena, California, by the way, the BYD plant. So they can have one.
They can.
Does that mean that, is that a backdoor into the Mexican market, that Pasadena plant? Or does Trudeau simply want to steal the BYD plant for himself?
Maybe he does. I don't think China's going to be building any plants after they kidnapped the Huawei executive. But anyway. Right. So Trudeau says one thing in this meeting, and then, stunningly, in a campaign event here, ends up saying totally the opposite.
Right.
So he's asked, all right, have you, we've heard that, there's some concern in Canada around this. Are you considering having just a bilateral deal between you and the United States, leaving Mexico out? And he at first says, no, we have the same position. We agree with this deal. Our number one priority is having a deal for all three countries, not necessarily pursuing something on the side or bilaterally with the United States. But then eventually says, but if that doesn't work out, we'll throw Mexico under the bus. We'll tell them to kick them out. We're going to play up on all of Trump's fears of a Chinese takeover. And we're going to say that it's a backdoor, and we're going to kick them out of the deal. We talked about this last week. We mentioned the fact that Canada stayed in the deal the last time it was renegotiated, thanks to Mexico. Thanks to Mexico. But in this case, he's like, we're leaving all the doors open because my job is always to defend Canadian jobs. Blah, blah, blah. Politician speak from Justin Trudeau. But I think his hypocrisy, his double-faced nature is really evident in this exchange. As you put here, Kurt, I'll let you read it. A frivolous man.
From a frivolous man, a frivolous attempt at blackmail, we didn't expect more or less. Okay. This is, cheap electioneering. He's on his way to getting thumped in the 2025 election. And just shows this absolute lack of principles that Canada was kept in the agreement thanks to AMLO, and just as an electoral gambit is willing to throw them under the bus for nothing, because then Trump comes out and says it's going to be 25% tariffs on both countries. So for nothing, right? You made yourself look pathetic and got nothing for it. Why not make common cause with Mexico against such a ridiculous idea that goes against the spirit of the agreement, instead of trying to grovel to Trump for, I repeat, nothing.
That's the part I really want to stress. And here's the other thing about Justin Trudeau. This is not the first time he's done this BS. I wanted to pull up this article from 2 years ago, where I actually think, despite my criticisms of The Guardian in general, that this headline is spot on. She angrily rebukes Trudeau over leaks to media about China-Canada relations. So this is from November 17th, so approximately 2 years ago, 2022, where in front of the cameras, there was a very clearly tense exchange between Trudeau and the Chinese premier, Xi Jinping, where he says it was not appropriate for details about a previous conversation between the leaders to have been shared on media, suggesting Trudeau had lacked sincerity in his approach. Quote, everything we discuss has been leaked to the paper. That's not appropriate, she says to Trudeau through a translator. And that's not the way the conversation was conducted. And in fact, there was a very distorted version of events that was leaked to the press about that conversation. Now, listen, I'm not a China expert. All I can say is what I've been following about China when it's come to Latin America more broadly, Mexico more specifically. But I interpret Xi Jinping to actually be a pretty credible, trustworthy official in a very powerful position. And in fact, I think when he has these conversations with world leaders, he understands that these are sensitive issues, and it's done in a good faith. But Trudeau kind of operates from a different playbook, from the Western politics playbook, decides to play games and say one thing to him in the meetings and then leak a different thing to the press. And so what did we see happen here in the case of Mexico? Virtually the same exact routine, saying one thing to a head of state and then another to your domestic audience because you're worried about the implications. It's slimy. It's gross. And I think it's part of the reason why he's so woefully unpopular in Canada, because people have been sick of his double-spaced standards constantly. I want to remind people, Justin Trudeau was elected on a progressive platform. He was celebrated as the coming of a new progressive age in North America, as a version of Obama for Canada. One of the key things he promised was changing Canada's electoral system. And it was the first promise he broke because he knew it wouldn't convenience them if they faced re-election the next time around. And so just a dishonest man from the almost virtually from the very beginning. This is the child of a prime minister, a previous prime minister, Pierre Trudeau, who's lived with a silver spoon in his mouth, who was never really interested in politics. It was actually his brother who was far more charismatic, but he died in an accident. And so suddenly he was in the spotlight and, became the leader of the Liberal Party, ran a smart campaign in 2015 and won, but has largely been breaking promises since. This is who Mexico has to deal with. Maybe we should kick Canada out. Maybe it's Canada who needs to be reconsidered to be part of this relationship because they're not trustworthy with this kind of leadership. Not that I'm a fan of Pierre Poilievre, not that I'm a fan of Jagmeet Singh. Canadian politics is a cesspool, but this is not a reliable partner in a very tense, delicate situation in North America right now.
Right, and he can just go off and then dance like a fool at the Taylor Swift concert, right? While while the whole situation kind of ratchets up. This is an interesting point too, that we've talked about the relative advantages that Mexico has in this situation that I think probably have been understated or underappreciated, in large part because the U.S. and Anglophone press about Mexico over the last 6 years has not appreciated the changes Mexico has gone through. But here's an important advantage that Mexico has. Mexico is quite unified at this point in its history. Claudia Sheinbaum won with a 30-point advantage and has a 70 to 80% approval rating going into this storm. She's got the public behind her, except for a tiny rump of conservatives who, she's never going to convince and doesn't have to. She's got a 70 to 80% approval rating. The country is unified around this. The country will be willing to, cut her some slack and weather some storms on this. And if that requires retaliatory tariffs, so be it. The United States is not unified at all. It's very split right down the middle, with a part that voted for Trump. Some people love Trump. Some people voted for Trump because of economic reasons and not out of any love of the man. And then half of the country loathes and despises him. Trudeau is wildly unpopular and is headed into an electoral defeat, which at this point in time, if the election were held today, would be a landslide defeat. So who's got the advantage in the political sense of who's got the most support of his or her public? In that case, it's clearly Mexico.
I previously reminded some of our viewers that there was a pretty important test early on in López Obrador's administration where he went after the resellers of gasoline, huachicoleros we call them here in Mexico. And it led to long gas lines, and it led to a difficult situation for many people who didn't have access to hydrocarbons in Mexico for a short period of time. And everybody was okay with it because they knew that it was important. And you're right. I think if Sheinbaum stands up to these bullies, both of them, Trudeau and Trump, and says, I'm defending Mexican interests, as she said she would when this first came up, when Trump election was announced, she said, we will face this as a sovereign country with dignity, right? I think they will rally behind her. If anything, it might actually accelerate the transformation that's happening here in Mexico. Oh, well, we agreed with your free trade plan, and now you're saying that these are not the rules that we can play, that you can just impose tariffs. Well, then maybe we should pursue a different political economy as well, not just diversifying who we export to or who we have trade relationships with, but maybe reorganizing parts of our economy for even a larger role of the state-run industries. That would be a welcome thing in my book. Be careful. Be careful with the fires that you're playing with, right? You may inadvertently provoke a deepening, a radicalization of what's happening here, which I think is welcome. In fact, I have a hypothesis that, in fact, it's what's been missing in this fourth transformation of Mexico. One of the key things in Venezuela that really radicalized things was the 2002 coup, when it made it clear that your rivals don't play by the same rules. They don't play by rules at all. So what are you going to do about it? And that really is what forced the Bolivarian Revolution to have to wrestle with reality and radicalize their process. That could very well happen here, and I think that actually would be welcome because, again, we're also talking about the survival of the planet. We're talking about really serious stakes here. And remind you, Claudia Sheinbaum is an environmental scientist. She also understands the stakes. All right, speaking of the environment and the stakes, I want to move on to our next topic here. Water in Mexico is a human right. So we saw this headline just from this past Friday. I'll read it out to you and I'll hand it over to Kurt. Water will stop being a commodity. It will be a basic right. With the National Water Plan, the private industry will return water, sufficient water, to supply Mexico City with at least 30 months of water. In Mexico, water will stop being seen as a commodity, affirmed President Sheinbaum, presenting the National Water Plan, which will have an investment of 20 billion pesos in 2025 as part of the budget process. In short terms, the headline says it all. Water was very much treated as a commodity here. CONAGUA, the institute that runs it, was created explicitly to facilitate the super exploitation of water as a resource in this country, to hand it over to private firms so that they could bottle it, package it, sell it, export it, whatever. And there was a rollback of that.
Right in time for NAFTA.
Right in time for NAFTA.
Mm-hmm.
Wink,
see exactly how that all worked?
Yeah, same with corn, right? That's why the countryside was abandoned. And now this is clearly an initiative stemming from Claudia Sheinbaum, from the president, from her office, to say, we're going to double down on this. This is important to us. And in fact, we're actually tied to other initiatives to try to rescue some of the rivers that have been heavily contaminated in this country. So pretty exciting, and they say that this is not a leftist process.
So, yeah, I have an article in Jacobin that we'll link to in the comments from a couple of years ago. It's called Multinational Corporations Are Sucking Mexico Dry. At the time of the water crisis in the city of Monterrey. And this year, of course, there were drought conditions throughout the entire country before the rainy season began. And it talks about, precisely how we got to this point in Mexico. And a lot of that has to do with the national water law passed by the Salinas de Gortari administration in the run-up to NAFTA in 1992. Like so much else passed in those years, the law was designed to transfer public resources into corporate hands, and this it did with a vengeance. Right? According to the former subdirector for water administration for CONAGUA, which Jose Luis just mentioned, 75% of all water licenses have been issued since the law was passed due to pressure from courts, right? They were pressured to get these licenses out the door, get them out the door, right? Once the aquifers were legally determined, some 250,000 licenses were handed out on the spot in order to inflate their prices, beginning with a system of over-licensing, which has only become worse as the agency is required to give more and more concessions or licenses. So a whole cottage industry in Mexico has been created with lawyers, with agencies and such, right, to get licenses into the hands of people who are willing to pay for them. And so this is how you got the water millionaires, a select group of elite families and companies that have accumulated vast water rights to their advantage, together with multinationals like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Danone, Nestle, Bimbo, and Aga, which take 35 billion gallons a year out of the ground, while a third of Mexican households lack daily basic piped water in their homes. And as anyone who lives in Mexico knows, you can't drink water out of the tap. So you have to buy water out of water jugs known as garrafones, and you also have companies like Danone getting in on that, right? Sucking Mexican water to the ground and selling it back to people in garrafones or in bottled water, because Mexico is the largest consumer of bottled water and bottled refresco. And then you have banks getting in on the act. Santander has 35 water licenses. HSBC has 25. BBVA has 10, and so on and so forth. And then you get to the point of these licenses, really, it's concentrated in very few hands. 1/5 of the water in Mexico is in the hands of just some 3,304 licenses, drawing water from 99 of 115 exploitable aquifers. So that's a lot of data. So please go to that article. You can read it with more calmly, con más detenimiento. But water is, big business, and it's big privatized business. And so the whole thrust of the Sheinbaum water plan, which she announced during the campaign and said it would come out in the first month, and it has, just about, is that water is a right as it's in the Constitution and not a commodity for private gain of domestic water millionaires and foreign multinationals, as I've just laid out. So what the water plan seeks to do is, first of all, to increase efficiency in agriculture through the technifying of agricultural irrigation of over 200,000 hectares, which would increase production of 51%. A lot of water is wasted in outdated irrigation systems. Then to attack the development of infrastructure of potable water, the cleaning up of rivers, and the development of strategic projects, right? And then to claw back the water from some of these, license hogs or water hogs. What you said is there's now a commitment from certain industries and some of the big players here to return some 2,500,000,000 cubic meters of water that they have licenses for and are not using, which is equivalent to 2.5 years of supply of water for the city of Mexico. So that's a pretty big deal, right? And the whole river issue, my God, I've lived in Oaxaca for 20 plus years. Oaxacans tell me that the Atoyac River right next to the city here, when they were kids in their infancy, there was enough water to swim in and wade through. Now it's dried up. It's dried up. It's a sewage. It's just for gray water and sewage. There's a little bit of trickle, but that's it. So that's within people's lifetimes that Mexico has lost the major rivers of its whole national aquifer system. And that has to do with deforestation. It has to do with contamination. It has to do with the sucking of water out of the ground. It has to do with the sucking water out of rivers and, the draining of gray and black waters into rivers and a whole other series of things. So that would be welcome. And then a whole other series of infrastructure plans, aqueducts, and dams and such to get water to where it needs to go, right? But the big thing here, the big thing is the water licenses. Now, what she's talking about in this plan is a voluntary plan, right? That some of the water hogs basically have agreed to voluntarily give back some of their concessions, some of their licenses, to avoid stiffer legislation. You saw some of the same approach when AMLO approached major food suppliers here, and they came to an agreement to voluntarily keep prices down on the basic basket of foodstuffs in order to avoid stricter regulations. So, all right, if they want to go that route, I don't know if voluntarily, the voluntary route is going to be enough to solve this chronic problem of 30 years of privatization, but it's a start. So it's an exciting project, and I, for one, would like to have to stop buying pipas and garrafones at some point in my life, and I'm sure I'm not alone.
Absolutely. The strategy is interesting. Like you said, it's about negotiation first. All right, come to the table. You know what the problem is. We know we want to do something about it. What are you offering? But I will remind people, it reminds me a bit of the story around Calica, this port in the Yucatan. Same thing. Let's negotiate. Let's figure this out. Mm-hmm. They decided to play hardball, and they ended up getting expropriated. If they want to play hardball, we know how far the government's willing to go. And I think that's why they're so eager to negotiate, because they know that if they don't do something about it, the alternative is far more punitive for them. It'll be far more heavy-handed intervention by the government, which they absolutely should, because this is not a controversial position. Water is a human right. It's recognized in international agreements. It's recognized in the Mexican Constitution. And it's time to make that a reality.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're going to bring to our final two segments, good news from Mexico and losers and haters. Of course, we'll start with good news. This one's a quick one. We saw this video come across our feeds and we had to share it with you. This is the bit of a ceremony, the event to welcome the new Palestinian ambassador to Mexico. So as we know, under López Obrador, for the first time, Mexico recognized Palestine as a state and decided to open diplomatic relations, which leads to eventually the naming of an ambassador. So this is the ambassador for the Palestinian Authority coming and receiving her credentials and receiving an incredibly warm welcome from representatives from Mexico's Congress. And the reason I found it moving was because, you know, as someone who consumes a lot of media in English and is forced to follow things in North America and Western Europe, especially when it comes to the ongoing genocidal campaign by the Zionist entity in Palestine against the Palestinian people, much of the coverage has been largely aimed at vilifying, demonizing Palestinian people, of suggesting that anybody associated with the resistance is a terrorist. You would never see a scene like this in any European Union country, certainly not in the United States, certainly not in Canada. Canada actually just finished making a prisoner advocacy organization, Samidoun, a terrorist organization, raiding the leader of that organization with heavy weapons and smoke grenades, disturbing all of her neighbors to clearly send a message, right? That's the priority of these so-called human rights defending Western governments. And meanwhile, here in Mexico, cheers, applause, tears, fists in the air, celebrating, recognizing the Palestinian representative. And I think is really, really quite telling, especially given the news this week where we saw the ICC issue arrest warrants against Netanyahu, against his former defense minister. Mm-hmm. The ICC, I will remind you, the International Criminal Court, actually is considering this case thanks to intervention in part by Chile and Mexico, which brought it before the court to say, you have to do something to stop this genocide. It's actually happening. What a contrast. And what a welcome piece of news. It makes me really, really proud that the process has gotten to this point where you can see scenes like this and it's not controversial. It shouldn't be. We know it's made to be. But it really is something that makes me extraordinarily proud as a Mexican that when it comes to supporting the liberation struggle of the Palestinian people, we open all of the doors to their representatives and leaders.
Yeah, and I think it's also important because, let's recall that Mexico recognized Palestine as a state in 2023. It was one of the last Latin American countries to do that. Most of the South American countries during the pink wave had already done that, and Mexico had held out because of its servile pro-U.S. foreign policy throughout the neoliberal era. So Mexico under AMLO, quite rightly, did recognize Palestine in 2023, just a few months before October 7th, ironically, but it did it very surreptitiously. Like we almost don't want anybody to notice. I wrote an article about it at the time, but it went mostly unnoticed by the world press. They just kind of upgraded on the Relaciones Exteriores site, right? The Palestine delegation to ambassador, and put out a very, very quick little announcement. That was it. There was no public announcement.
You had to do some digging. You had to make some phone calls.
Yeah, it was not mentioned in the Mañanera. No, big announcement about it. And it was kind of like, all right, we're going to do the right thing, but we kind of still don't want the U.S. to notice. So what's great about what you see here is this very public reception, this very public receiving of Nadia Rashid, who was Palestine's ambassador, I believe, in Uruguay, and is now going to take up the helm here in Mexico. This was not, an official foreign ministry meeting, but it was Morena in the Congress, and I like to see Morena flexing its muscle on this, right? I say if the foreign ministry is not going to make a big deal about it, well, we will. We will. Morena in Congress is going to make a big deal about it. And so they received Nadia Rashid in Congress, and, as Jose Luis came out, it was a very emotional ceremony. So I think that was important to publicly show that Mexico backs Palestine, and not that when it does the right thing, it does it kind of under the table, so don't want people to notice. It's like, let's show this. Let's show this. Let's be out there.
And let's chant from the river to the sea.
Yeah.
Palestine will be free. That is not, as the Western pundits and politicians claim, a genocidal chant. Please. It is a longing for the liberation of the people of Palestine. It is not what they claim it is. And so to hear this in the halls of power really neutralizes those efforts to try to cast it as this kind of hate speech that some have tried to make. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. So finally, losers and haters this week. We have this headline, which interestingly uses the same picture we were looking at earlier from the AP. Afraid of losing the U.S.-Canada trade pact. Mexico alters its laws and removes Chinese parts. Woo! This article should have come out in late October with the language it's using. Mexico's ruling party is so afraid of losing the trade deal that President Claudia Sheinbaum said Friday the government has gone on a campaign to get companies to replace Chinese parts with locally made ones. Oh boy! Scary times.
Yes. It's so funny too, because this is the perception of Mexico, right? That it's the scared little country rushing to please its colonial master, right? The background to this story is that Mexico is in the process of eliminating what are known as the autonomous agencies, which are these autonomous executive branch agencies that were set up in the post-NAFTA era to give Mexico this facade of, modern neoliberal technocratic democracy so they could tick off all the boxes for international, consumption. And then it turned out that these autonomous agencies were just living high on the hog. They were just jobs programs for, elites who couldn't get their buddies jobs in the actual government. So they just throw them into the autonomous agencies with fat credit cards and fat expense accounts. So, all of the corruption scandals coming out, for example, against the supposed transparency agency, with nice trips to table dances and trips to Europe and on the American Express card. And then it turns out that they were supposed to be, pushing for transparency and actually have been reserving documents against transparency. For example, about the Felipe Calderon war on drugs. It's like they've actually just been kicking the can down the road on that. These documents were supposed to come out this year. They put them in for another 5 years, so they're not going to come out until 2029. So good transparency agency you got there. Table dances and not providing transparency. So Mexico quite correctly, and the Cuatro T said, we're getting rid of these. We're getting rid of these. These are executive branch functions that can be carried out by executive branch agencies like happen in plenty of other countries. So in order to be in coherence with the free trade agreement, they have to be kind of decentralized agencies within the executive branch. So fine. That's what they're going to do. They're going to make them decentralized agencies within executive agencies instead of autonomous ones. So what the AP tries to make this out is they're scrambling and they're scared to lose the free trade agreement, so they're changing their laws. It's like, wait a minute. They're in a free trade agreement, so they're complying with the free trade agreement. And when they're complying with the free trade agreement, you said they're scared and scrambling. So what is it? You say it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you don't comply with the free trade agreement, then you're not in compliance, and we're going to take you to an international panel. If you do comply with the free trade agreement, it's like, you're scared and you're scrambling. You see how they slap you in both ways? Or they try to in the U.S. press? Silly stuff. Just silly stuff, right?
Just the choice of language, right? I'm just kind of casually scrolling here, scrambling with private companies to get them to move parts production here. It's the kind of language they would only use. And here's the thing. There's not a lot of reporting in this piece. It's mostly an aggregated story from comments made by officials here in Mexico. And I found it really curious that a piece that was actually reported. Now, we all know we're not fans of the New York Times here, New York Times, but this piece was actually reported. It's actually pretty lengthy. It's many, far, far lengthier reports, interviewing experts, blah, blah, blah. And this headline stands in stark contrast. This one from Natalia Kichurov says, why Mexico isn't panicking about another Trump presidency. And it's actually quite interesting. If you go into it, some of the arguments made are actually pretty convincing. If Trump really does go all out in this global rivalry with China, Mexico comes out a winner. for all the reasons we talked about earlier in the program, right? This actually can have an increase in its manufacturing. That manufacturing has to be replaced if it's going to be, eliminated from China. So there's actually opportunities here. Mexico is not panicking. It's not scrambling. It isn't afraid, as this headline claims here, of losing the U.S.-Canada trade pact. You think Claudia Sheinbaum is worried about Justin Trudeau? Of course not, right? I think there is reason to be concerned about what Trump is talking about, and we've talked about that extensively on this program. But this idea, it doesn't match reality. And anybody who does even the slightest bit of digging finds that Mexico is not panicking. You know who is panicking?
If even the New York Times came to that conclusion, right?
Exactly.
Then
you know who is panicking?
Yeah.
Canada, as I mentioned, they hit the panic button. They reconstituted their emergency committee at the cabinet level. They're the ones freaking out, but they don't get an article like that. Because Canada is a white settler country. Canada is run by a center-right government. But Mexico, with a woman, scientist, president, oh no, they must be freaking out. It smells a little bit of sexism, to be honest, now that I think about it. But that's what you get from the AP. They're increasingly bad when it comes to Mexico. One thing is Mark Stevenson, who seems to be out on a mission to smear Mexico wherever he can. But the AP in general has been pursuing a untruthful lie, right? Like they're really starting to play with their own credibility. Not that it's very good to begin with, but we're increasingly running out of places to even bare bones information about Mexico from the wires. Reuters is not much better.
Yeah. And, this is exactly what you said. It's this use of this stereotype, right, of the weak brown country that has to scramble to basically say, yes, massa, right, against what the U.S. mandates, from above. And that's just not what happened. That's not what's happening. It's just not what's happening. And the problem with this bad press is it leads to poor decision making in the United States. Because if they think that's what's happening and they're going to create, a whole tariff threat as a result of what the AP, and other wire services may be reporting, and then it winds up blowing up in their face, well, they're going to kind of be surprised, won't they? So I hope they have their own ears to the ground to realize that this is not the case. Right?
Fortunately, for our viewers and listeners, they have the ear to the ground thanks to their participation in this program, Soberania. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, to watching us, to keeping up with us. All of your comments, always great to see you. Providing your feedback there in the comments, feel free to leave some more. Special shout out, as always, to the St. Patrick's Battalion, which is going the extra mile and supporting our work directly. If you're interested, join below. If you're on YouTube, hit that join button. Support us. It's only 99 pesos a month, approximately $5 US. Help us if you can. If not, of course, we don't put things behind a paywall. This will always be free for you. That brings us to the end of another episode. Kurt, any last words? Any words from our special guest?
The special guest has skittered off. So I don't think we're going to be able to get a closing from Kali. But she sent her regards. As do I. And just to say that my name is Kurt Hackbarth, together with Jose Luis Grande Ceja. It's been a pleasure sharing all of this with you another hour a week. And we've got some also interesting live projects coming up. So, as always, this has been another episode of Soberania.